The current zeitgeist is of the day, people are just following it. They start by redefining life in the womb, then they go to redefining marriage, then they go to redefining gender. Between the time Benedict was chosen in 2005, when we had two genders, male and female, but he died a few weeks ago, we now have over 100 gender options, right? So that's relativism run amok. And that's really what's governing the Western world.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marla Slayback and Tom Sarut.
Today's guest is Paul Kengor, who is a professor of political science at Grove City College, as well as the executive director of the Institute for Faith and Freedom and the editor of the American Spectator. He is the author of over a dozen books, including Dupes, The Pope and a President, and The Divine Plan, all of which were published by ISI Books. He joins us today to talk about the reposed Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI and his contributions to Western thought in the modern world and, of course, the Catholic Church. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Good to be with you and good to reconnect with Marlo. Marlo and I are both University of Pittsburgh alumni.
Right.
and not just that, but we both also were editorial page editors for the Pitt News, the student newspaper. Yeah. So that's kind of right. That's how we started writing, basically.
And we were also born at the same hospital, turns out.
That's right. Although you were born there a little bit later than I was, by about 30 years, I'm sure. 30 plus years. But yeah, we're recording. I probably shouldn't go off topic here. But the number of different notable editors, Marlo, that we've had at the Pitt News, who were prominent conservatives, who've gone on to do things, that's something that maybe somebody ought to write up. It's quite a list. And
it is. The Pitt News is. I tell people absolutely, like, the Collegiate Network is doing wonderful work, but I got to give the Pitt News credit too, because it was such a just a edifying experience. It is what you make of it, right? If you're a conservative, because you're surrounded by people who are, opposed to your views. And I can only imagine it's probably gotten worse since, in terms of the polarization on campus since I was there. But definitely, if you're conservative on the University of Pittsburgh campus and you have opinions, join the opinions team, because that campus could use your voice for sure.
And I tell my students at Grove City College all the time, and other students around the country who want to start writing, and they're looking for a way to break in. And it's hard to get published when you're 19 years old.
Right.
You just can't get published typically at any of the leading publications. So I tell them, well, start with your school newspaper.
Definitely.
Build a portfolio there. And when I was the editorial page editor in 1989-90, we published 4 days a week. We were print edition. I think we had 50,000 circulation. There was a newspaper strike in Pittsburgh around that time. So at one point, we literally had the largest circulation of any print publication in Pittsburgh. But that's really where you can start developing your talent. And also, I would tell young conservatives listening right now, that's where you really learn to first take your shots. And I mean, the first article that I wrote, Marlo, was on homelessness. And I was a pre-med major. I was pre-med, biochem, biophysics major, working for the organ transplant team at the University of Pittsburgh. And it started with a letter to the editor of the Pitt News about homelessness, where I did my kind of own investigation, because I was puzzled at why these people on campus called liberals were blaming homelessness on Reagan.
Yeah.
And I wasn't even political, and I just didn't understand it. And the editorial page editor liked it, ran it as a column, and the letters to the editor, I was called a racist, all these other names, and I didn't even mention race nowhere.
Right.
And I thought, who are these people? Why are they calling me these things? And then the next column that I wrote was on aiding the Contras in Nicaragua. Then I got called a fascist and a Nazi for the first time. And I thought, who are these people? They're just wild, man. They will call you anything. And so you kind of learn there as a young conservative that, welcome to the world of conservative journalism. Get used to it, baby, because this is what it's going to be like for the rest of your life.
Well, it sounds like things haven't changed too much from the time that you were at Pitt, because I'm sure my colleagues at, or my peers they had similar experiences as conservatives. And this is actually a great way to start the episode to kind of plug an event we have coming up at the University of Pittsburgh. It's going to be our final Diana Davis Spencer debate of the year at Pitt on April 18th, and it will be on the subject of transgenderism. So it'll be Michael Knowles versus Deirdre McCluskey. It's open to the public. So yeah, if you're listening or you're in the area, if you go to Grove City or if you go to Duquesne, Carnegie Mellon, wherever, Steubenville, come to Pittsburgh on April 18th. It starts at 7:00. So hope to see you there. We will definitely, a lot of the ISI staff will be there because we expect it to be a big event.
Well, we did an ISI event at Pitt. I think you might have introduced me. I was the moderator, and it was a debate on gun control. Right? I think it was and it was Hans von Spasowski. I always have trouble saying his last name. I'm sorry.
And Alex Nauraste, right?
Exactly. And Alex was with Cato, it was immigration, right?
It was immigration.
It was immigration. Yeah. And Hans was with, I think, National Review and Heritage Foundation.
Yeah.
I'll never forget this. The students in the auditorium, and this is my alma mater I'm saying this about, they behaved like children. They brought kazoos and just started blowing them and I could see the whole audience. They had come to protest and disrupt. And even Alex, who had a position to the left of them, I mean, he in terms of like really open immigration, right?
Right.
And they were shouting down Alex. Alex was baffled. He's like, "What are you doing?" And the fact was they weren't listening. They weren't listening. They're
not there to listen.
To protest. It was really shocking and an absolute embarrassment. And of course, it happens all over the country. Probably at ISI events all over the country.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, that's what we hope that people are coming to the debate to listen, but we also, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But I do expect some detractors to also attend. So. Hopefully we have more open minds than kazoos at this upcoming event.
Right.
But before we
bring
get
your
to
kazoo.
we'll have to check people for different party instruments.
Right. Sign on the door. No kazoos.
Exactly. But before we get to our interview, we'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission is to educate for liberty. If you would like to join us in fulfilling this mission, make sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help to reach more listeners like yourselves. So, Dr. Kengor, if you could start by telling us a little bit more. Obviously, this episode is being recorded after the death of His Holiness Pope Benedict. And me and Tom were even discussing before we got on this call was we actually don't know too much about the life of Pope Benedict. I mean, I've been learning and kind of, my husband was reading his book on Jesus, I think called Jesus of Nazareth.
Great book.
Yeah, I've been learning through osmosis through him.
A series of books. Yeah.
I mean, he seems like a totally brilliant mind, right? Mm-hmm. Just this Pope scholar. And you have, you've done so much research on Pope JP too. So would love to learn more about, if you could just set the scene for us, as far as your book, The Pope and the President, that relationship, especially that took place during the era of communist Europe, and what kind of information can help us better discuss the life of Pope Benedict?
Yeah, he actually figures pretty prominently in that book, A Pope and a President, which was edited by Jed Donahue at ISI Books. So I just an amazing editor, the best editor I've ever had. Anthony Sacramone was there at the time too. He did an amazing job with it, and we followed it up with the Divine Plan, which is a book that I did with my friend Rob Orlando, who did a documentary on Reagan and John Paul II by that same name, which is really good. I highly recommend it. Check it out. Go to YouTube. Go wherever. Check it out. But the John Paul II had tapped him, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, to be his head for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the CDF. And Ratzinger, he was German. He came out of Vatican II, and at one point he was considered one of the liberals, one of the more liberal cardinals in the church. But some of them went, and this was a real hard lesson for him and a number of other people to learn. They found out that some of these progressives in the church just kept progressing, right? So the call for reform kind of never ends to the point where it breaks away from any orthodoxy, becomes heterodoxy, and eventually they start to pursue positions that are antithetical to the church teachings, sometimes heretical to church teachings. Individuals like Hans Kuhn, a number of others. And so it's ironic that he eventually became Cardinal Ratzinger, known as this conservative in the church, because simply he didn't go as far to the left as they did. Now, I would say that he was, I guess, in a sense, these terms I don't like, conservative, liberal, they don't really fit well with the church. But he was orthodox. He followed the church's teachings. He didn't want to change the church's teachings. So John Paul II brought him in as head for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which if you look it up on Wikipedia and other places, was referred to the Office of the Inquisition, right? So he was the inquisitor, the bulldog, right? In fact, liberals to this day, I just saw that somebody, Marlo, got fired from Twitter, a journalist, maybe at Politico, for referring to him as. He used the word Nazi, joined the Nazi youth, called him all kinds of other names, Hitler youth. But he came up through the church during that period when anybody who was a teenage boy in Hitler's Germany was forced to join the Nazi youth. I mean, he was certainly not a Nazi, right, by any stretch. But needless to say, but he became this. He and John Paul II were so crucial in so many ways. I mean, I could go on and on. Let me just give maybe two quick examples. One, the Catechism was reissued under the papacy of John Paul II. And if you go through and you read it, it's an extraordinary document. I'm a convert to Roman Catholicism. And the first time that I read the Catechism of the Catholic Church, I was just blown away. And I went to the index to read what it said about capital punishment, what it said about social issues, abortion, birth control, you name it, and the whole lucidity, the reason, the incorporation of faith and reason, Fides et ratio, as the John Paul II encyclical is called, around 1993, is just, it's so enormously impressive. And it struck me as a Protestant. I knew that Catholics claim that they have this thing called the magisterium, where the Holy Spirit speaks through the magisterium of the church. And when I read that document, I thought, they might have a point here. This is beyond something that human beings would read. When I would go to Christian bookstores, which were typically Protestant Christian bookstores, and the Catholic section might have maybe Augustine's Confessions and a couple of other things, that I never saw anything there on the shelves that could even compare to the kind of thing that I was reading there. And then that I went on to read in the encyclicals of John Paul II. Humanae Vitae was done by Paul VI. John Paul II's follow-up was Evangelium Vitae. He also did Veritatis, Splendor. If you go back and you read those encyclicals, those are my three favorite. And then you start reading as well the writings of Cardinal Ratzinger. And later what Benedict XVI said, you can see Ratzinger's imprint in all of those, his hand in all of those. So that was enormously important. And I would add too, and here's what I talk about in A Pope and a President, but Ratzinger was the guy that John Paul II called on to issue the commentary on the third secret of Fatima, which he did in June 2000. And that was, we could talk this whole podcast about Fatima. It's an extraordinary thing. And I spent a lot of time on it, on that book. But John Paul II was shot on the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima, May 13th, 1981. He came back. He went to Fatima a year later, May 13th, 1982, took the bullet that had been inside of him that was removed during surgery. I'll use a water bottle as an example, and put it in the crown of the statue of the Blessed Mother at Fatima, and everybody was scratching. why did he do that? Why did he do that? And no one at that point knew what the third secret of Fatima was. It was finally divulged in May 13th, 2000, when John Paul II went back to Portugal. Cardinal Sedano just kind of dropped this bomb and didn't say, I'm about to tell you what the third secret of Fatima is, but then went and talked and said what the third secret of Fatima was, which was the prediction by these issued to the children of Fatima in July 1917, July 13th, 1917, that the bishop in white, a pope, would be shot and killed. And John Paul II believed that applied to him on May 13th, 1981. About a month after that, June 2000, it was left to Cardinal Ratzinger to do the theological commentary on Fatima, where he interpreted it. And that was really kind of a profound entree in a way to the next millennium, the 21st century. And he would be the guy who eventually followed John Paul II as Pope when John Paul II died, April 2nd, 2005.
Sticking with, I guess, the pre-papal days of when the then Cardinal Ratzinger, so he's sort of, I guess, seen as a scholar figure, an intellectual, perhaps part of the reason why he was tapped to give the theological commentary, as you were mentioning there. But what is his, from your reading of his work, and like Marla said, I consider myself sort of a Pope Francis Catholic. I'm a revert, so I'm only paying attention after 2013. But I guess his general worldview, his sort of philosophical and theological approach to life, to Christian living, and to the church in the modern world, stuff like that.
Yeah, and you can, by the way, you can see that thoughtfulness and that scholarly nature of him, even in that theological commentary. It just comes through. And you could tell that John Paul II is thinking, if I want someone to do a theological commentary on Fatima, that's the guy. That's the guy that I want to do it. Because he was, Tom, he was a scholar. He was first and foremost a scholar. When he became Pope in 2005, after the death of John Paul II, April 2005, he chose as his papal motto, coat of arms, the beast of burden. And that was his way of saying that I think that this was a burden to him. He didn't want to be Pope. He wanted to, I don't think he ever wanted to do any of this stuff. He wanted to be a writer, a scholar, an academic. In fact, when he first gets into the papacy, he starts banging out right away these books, including the Jesus of Nazareth book, which is really good. And if you read that book, I mean, throughout, he's using words that a lot of kind of lay Catholics wouldn't expect, like exegetes, and he's using all these kind of academic, scholarly words. But you're reading through this book, you think, this is what this guy really wants to do. He doesn't want to be messing around with the politics of the Curia. He wants to be writing about the life of Christ. So, and going forward, I think that presaged in a way his resignation in 2013, because he got to a point where the burden was so significant, and also too, very important, and we don't know all the reasons why he resigned. Maybe you wanted to talk about this. But he did watch what John Paul II went through in the final years of his pontificate. John Paul II started October 1978. He was there 27 years. And the last 3 or 4 years, he was so hobbled, bent over literally from Parkinson's. He could barely move his face. He could barely talk. And so Benedict XVI didn't ever want that to happen to him. Now, how ironic that he would live almost another 10 years, right? Almost into 2013, died on New Year's Eve. I don't know if you remember, but my friend John Gizzi, who writes for Newsmax now, John put out in December 2021 an article that got a giant amount of hits about how at the Curia, the Vatican, they were already preparing for the next papal conclave because they were expecting Pope Francis to die. Pope Francis to die in 2022. So a lot of us were thinking, wow, man, Benedict's going to outlive Francis. and when Francis was chosen in 2013, I remember having a conversation immediately with a couple other Catholic friends, And we knew about his health problems. We knew about his age. And we thought, this is not a young pope. Well, everyone kind of expected they would go for a younger pope at that point. You know, the Catholics have this phrase in Italian, right? I won't say it in Italian, but you get a fat pope, you get a skinny pope. You get an old pope, you get a young pope, right? So they thought they were going to get maybe someone in his 50s. They get this older guy with one lung, and I don't think anybody thought he would live longer than about 2018, but now he's going into the 10th year of his papacy. So I don't know how far, I might have got pretty far away from your original question there, Tom, but he was, first and foremost a scholar, and the idea of people on the left who insulted him and blasted him and called him all these names and accused him of, arrogance and this, and he was very humble. He didn't want the job, and that should have finally been proven to them when he resigned, the first pope to resign in 598 years. I think 1415 was the previous. It was an extraordinary thing. I was at morning mass that morning, and my priest came up to me and said, "Did you hear what just happened?" And I said, "No, what?" And he said, Pope Benedict just resigned." I said, "He what?" He said, "He resigned." I said, "He resigned? Can he resign?" He said, "He just did." Wow! So it was just a shock.
So and we're actually recording this kind of like off topic, but I think yesterday it was Cardinal Pell passed away.
Yeah.
So another unfortunate, may he rest in peace, death in the church. I'm wondering, how would you define the papacy of Pope Benedict? Because he obviously, he was this scholar who, his last words were, "Jesus, I love you." And, for Christians, but especially Catholics, that was such a testament to, especially if you knew of Benedict and his work, and, maybe you've read Jesus of Nazareth, you just know that this man, I think he said he was just a humble servant in the vineyard of Christ, something along those lines, and just such eloquently expressed passion for Christ, and but obviously, his papacy was marked by a very unfortunate scandal that is still, throughout the years has come to light, that plagues the church. What were the other areas of focus throughout his papacy? Obviously, that was happening in the background as well, and he was writing. And can you set the scene for kind of the context of his papacy, since a lot of our listeners, if they're students, were probably quite young at the time?
Yeah. By the way, I met Cardinal Pell in Pittsburgh last year. He was the Knights of Malta brought him in. He spoke at the church on the north side. And
was it Most Precious Blood of Jesus by chance?
Yeah. No, I forget which one it was.
Okay.
But
I was married and had my child baptized there. It's a traditional Latin Mass parish in Pittsburgh.
Exactly,
So I wouldn't be surprised if he was there. Okay.
In fact, my former student assistant goes there. It goes to that church. Yeah,
Great.
It's a great church. But yeah, and he was really aging when I saw him last year. But with Benedict, I maybe starting at the very beginning, two things that really jump out. So one, when he comes out on the balcony and he declares himself, like you said, Marlo, a humble servant in the vineyard, and then when he gave his name, Pope Benedict XVI. That probably wasn't on anybody's list of what he would choose, but he's invoking there Pope Benedict XV, who was 1914 to 1922, who was the Pope who had tried to prevent the outbreak of World War I, tried to stop World War I. So had Pius X before him, and in fact it was Benedict XVI, Benedict XV. They're referred to World War I as an unjust war, the collective suicide of Europe. These countries should not be fighting one another. None of these countries had a really good reason to be at war with one another. World War II, we went in there, America, Britain, that was a just war, right? There we had a clear enemy there that was very much merited going to war against. But this was the suicide of Western civilization, World War I. It was the meat grinder. Michael Hall said, World War I actually exceeded the horrors of World War II in the sense of the sheer futility of squandered lives. Even though there were far more people were killed in World War II, World War I was so unjustified. It was so stupid, so stupid. So you had, by invoking that name, Benedict XVI is trying to once again, I think, save Europe from itself. And in this case, from what? From a voluntary de-Christianization of the continent. Hilaire Belloc once said, the faith is Europe and Europe is the faith, which indeed it was. Europe is the home of not only the Vatican, but all the reformers, all the different people of the Reformation, Martin Luther, John Huss, John Calvin, and Geneva, right? Westminster. So to have Europe suddenly voluntarily rejecting God, the first kind of real de-Christianization was the French Revolution, where the barbarians, the Jacobins, were hauling off priests and nuns and taking them to the guillotine, and Robespierre and guillotining 40,000 people in Paris alone, 1793 to 1794, recreating the calendar, starting all over again at year one. But now here we were in 2013, and the continent was voluntarily throwing away from God. The Polish people chanted when John Paul II went there in June 1979, "We want God, we want God." It's like Europeans today are chanting, "We don't want God, we don't want God." And obviously, I'm not talking about all Europeans, right? But the churches are empty. All these countries have like 10% mass attendance rates among Catholics. It's just a disaster. So I think he was hoping to turn that around. He's more interested in that than he is in dealing with the politics of the Curia. And he was not able to reverse that. He was not able to reverse it. I think the other thing was what he said right before the conclave met to elect him, and that's his Dictatorship of relativism speech. And maybe you could put up the piece that I wrote for the American Spectator on that. His calling for, saying that what the West is facing now is a new kind of dictatorship, a kind of dictatorship of relativism, where, quoting from, I believe it's Ephesians, how people just toss around like children, like infants, from every wind, and whatever the current zeitgeist is, there's a German word, right? Whatever the current zeitgeist is of the day, people are just following it. They start by redefining life in the womb, then they go to redefining marriage, then they go to redefining gender. Between the time Benedict was chosen in 2005, when we had two genders, male and female, but when he died a few weeks ago, we now have over 100 gender options, right? So that's relativism run amok, and that's really what's governing the Western world. He tried to stop that sort of thing. And Pope Francis, for as maligned as he is by conservative Catholics, has been really strong on gender ideology, on male-female marriage. He said, has really condemned transgenderism. I wrote a 5,000-word piece for Crisis Magazine a couple years ago on all these statements from Francis that liberals ought to despise and set their hair on fire over, and that conservatives ought to love. But neither Benedict nor Francis have been able to reverse the dictatorship of relativism, which is indeed now governing and dictating the Western world.
Maybe we could use that as a segue, and you touched on this at the beginning when we were talking about Benedict's role at Vatican II, but sort of, I guess, Vatican II is, a deeper and closer look at how the church would look in the modern world in the 20th century. And that's brought a lot of consternation and perhaps some division, unfortunately, within the Catholic Church. And as you mentioned at the time that Benedict was more liberal, and he's, become more conservative, or he later ended up being more conservative. But I think, from what I know, a lot of what Pope John Paul II and Benedict XVI's papacies were in part was trying to make peace with Vatican II and the living tradition of the Catholic Church over 2,000 years. And so they developed things like the hermeneutic of continuity, stuff like that. But
it's a typical Benedict phrase, isn't it? The hermeneutic of continuity. People are like, what does that mean? That's exactly. Classic Benedict right there.
It takes a while to figure out. I guess the question would be something.
Well, I think I know what you're saying.
I guess if Benedict XV was one who wanted to sort of keep apart the enmity between the European nations, given the sort of problems that we see in the modern world today, the dictatorship of relativism, what was Benedict doing, and how did, I guess, Vatican II and his approach to Vatican II, what does that look like for the future church and the current church today?
I would say that it was Benedict and John Paul II who had the interpretation of Vatican II right. I mean, they were the ones that interpreted it correctly. A former priest friend of mine, he's now deceased, but he told me about being in seminary at the time of Vatican II, and a very liberal, progressive priest seminary teacher go into the blackboard and drawing out, the structure of the church, how this works, how that works, and everything, and then turning to the classroom and just saying with great pride and confidence and arrogance, all of this has changed, right? All of this has now changed. And in fact, it hadn't. But what guys like that were going to do with Vatican II was weaponize it to try to argue that everything was now up for grabs. Everything now could be questioned. Everything could be changed. And that's where I think guys like Ratzinger at first thought, well, no one's going to do that. I mean, that's not going to happen. No one would be that reckless and irresponsible. And then he starts to see among some of his colleagues and cohorts that that's exactly what they want to do. He said, whoa, hold on a second, right? Stop. This is not where we're supposed to go with this. You are wrong. And in some cases, if you don't stop this, we might have to tell you to quit publishing your books, right? We might have to really crack down. We might have to accuse you of heresy, maybe even blasphemy. That was their project, and it was misbegotten. It wasn't where Vatican II was supposed to go.
So, what would you foresee for the future of the church, being that, especially, I mean, I mentioned earlier, I attend a traditional Latin Mass parish, so many lowercase o Orthodox Catholics in my parish, many of which were very upset, quite frankly, when there were guidelines surrounding the permissions on practicing in the traditional form of the Mass.
Yeah, rightly so.
Yeah, across the country. Fortunately, in Pittsburgh, our parish has been spared of that, so we're still able to, hold the Tridentine Mass. But I do know a lot of Catholics who are, and especially in ISI, you meet a lot of lowercase o Catholics. So I think this is pertinent to a lot of our listeners, but also the greater Christian world. I think. What you foresee with the death of Benedict, who appreciated the Mass of the Ages as he did, and given that over the past, I think it was 2021, that the encyclical kind of, stamping down on the traditional form of the Mass pre-Vatican II came out. Are you cautiously optimistic? I mean, we can ask, obviously, Pope Benedict to pray for us that we are able to continue this form of the Mass. But I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
After his death.
I think it's that's one of the worst things that Francis did, and I think he's. So I just said a bunch of nice things about him, right? So that I could establish my bona fides here, now to criticize him. But he has. I defended him for years. Wrote a lot of articles defending him, and I've stopped because it's now just complete chaos and confusion. And a lot of it has to deal with the people that he's appointing, and the people who probably aren't going to pursue this kind of orthodoxy that he has had on certain moral social issues. And I can't understand or explain. I think a lot of it has to do with who's guiding him, who he's appointed around him. On the other hand, I have people telling me, no, you're deceived. He's a deceiver. He's doing this for purposes of deception. And the problem, Marlo, Tom, is you just don't know. I mean, I will read some of these things late at night on my laptop and I'm looking up like, Lord, could you please straighten this out? Who is he lying? Is he lying? What's going on here? Right? What's happening? This is chaos. This is confusion. I don't know what to believe. And then to go into some of the political stuff. Did he just override Nancy Pelosi's bishop, Cordileone, and after saying all these things about defending bishops and tell Nancy to go get the Eucharist? What did he tell Biden? Biden says that he said this. Did he say that? Who's lying here? Who's telling the truth? And you just don't know. And you didn't have this kind of chaos and confusion under Benedict. You didn't have it under John Paul II. So it's really been just a train wreck. And I think his handling of COVID was just awful, especially going against what his own magisterium congregation has said about as a Catholic you have freedom of conscience. No one can force you to get a vaccine against your will. That is very clearly the case in the Catholic Church. And he came out and made statements like, you're morally obligated to get vaccinated. And I had Catholics say, well, he didn't exactly say that. He didn't exactly say this. But he did. And I know young Catholics all over the country in colleges and also older Catholics who at their Catholic school where they teach or where they attend try to submit a religious exemption, providing the documentation of the Catholic Church on this. And the administrator said, what are you talking about? The Pope says you're morally obligated to get vaccinated. And these people lost in every case, just like that. So that's just one example. But the confusion and the chaos, we're clearly losing people in the Catholic Church right now. You just can't look to Rome in the way that you could before for kind of consistent, clear leadership on the major issues of the day.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Kengor. If our listeners would like to keep up on all of your latest work and your scholarship, where can they look? Where can they find you?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Sorry that I cut out there. Maybe it was the good Lord stopping me from going on about unloading on Pope Francis. But you can follow me. I write for the American Spectator. I'm the editor there. So spectator.org. You can sign up for my columns there for free. And I write usually once a week on average. And also Grove City College, our Institute for Faith and Freedom, which is faithandfreedom.com is the website. And also check out some of these books I did through ISI Books, The Pope and a President, The Divine Plan, Dupes. And I'm a great advocate of ISI, so appreciative of ISI and all that it has done for such a long time. And thank you both. I'm glad you're both there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kengor. And thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.